You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 6,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's dive into today's story. My name is Emily Kline, and I'm writing this while I still remember who I used to be. 3 months ago, I was an investigative journalist from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, chasing stories about municipal corruption and pharmaceutical fraud. I lived alone in a converted warehouse apartment, survived on black coffee and take-out Chinese food, and hadn't been inside a church since my grandmother's funeral 5 years earlier. Today something else is writing these words through my fingers. It started with my sister Emily's baptism, though I now understand it began 16 years before that, in the delivery room of Harrisburg General Hospital, where Emily Kline drew her first breath on a winter morning that the nurses still remember as unusually cold. Emily was extraordinary from the moment she learned to speak. While other toddlers struggled with basic vocabulary, she quoted scripture with perfect pronunciation. When our mother read her children's Bible stories, Emily would correct details that weren't in the text, providing historical context that made our parents exchange worried glances over her crib. By age 5, she was reading Latin hymns. By 7, she was explaining theological concepts that seminary students struggled to grasp. By 10, she was mediating family arguments with diplomatic wisdom that seemed impossible for a child to possess. Our parents, lapsed Catholics who attended Mass twice a year out of social obligation, didn't know what to make of their prodigy daughter. They enrolled her in advanced classes, consulted child psychologists, and eventually settled on the comfortable explanation that Emily was simply gifted with unusual intelligence and spiritual sensitivity. I knew better. I'd been watching Emily my entire life, and I'd noticed things that our parents either missed or chose to ignore. The way electrical lights flickered when she prayed. How animals seemed hypnotized by her presence, staring at her with unblinking attention that bordered on worship. The fact that she never seemed to sleep deeply, her eyes moving beneath closed lids, as if she were constantly listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. Most unsettling was her perfect behavior. Emily never threw tantrums, never rebelled, never showed the normal selfishness of childhood. She moved through life with purposeful grace that suggested someone much older was guiding her decisions. When I asked her about it once when she was 12, she tilted her head like a bird listening to distant music and said, "I have a very good teacher." Our parents assumed she meant her catechism instructor. I wasn't so sure. By age 16, Emily had become a local legend in our parish. She volunteered at St. Vincent's Food Bank every Saturday, arriving early to organise donations, with efficiency that impressed the adult coordinators. She tutored struggling students after school, displaying infinite patience, as she helped classmates who couldn't grasp concepts that seemed effortless to her. She attended daily Mass, not just Sundays, sitting in the front pew with focused attention that made Father Martinez uncomfortable. "It's like she's listening to something I can't hear," he confided to our mother after one particularly intense conversation about Emily's spiritual development. Her questions about doctrine go deeper than anything we study in seminary. Sometimes I feel like she's testing my knowledge rather than seeking guidance. That's when Emily announced her intention to undergo formal baptism. "I was baptized as an infant," she explained to our family over dinner one humid August evening. "But I want to choose this for myself now that I understand what it means. I want to make a conscious declaration of my faith before starting my final year of high school." Our parents exchanged the look of people who'd learned to be careful about questioning their daughter's spiritual instincts. Emily had never been wrong about religious matters, and her certainty had a way of making opposition seem not just futile but somehow spiritually dangerous. "Where would you want the ceremony?" our mother asked. "St. Mary's Basilica in Baltimore," Emily replied without hesitation. "It's the first cathedral built in America. I want to be baptized somewhere that carries the weight of authentic Catholic history." She'd already researched the procedure, contacted the appropriate priests and scheduled the ceremony for October 15th. All she needed was family support and transportation to Baltimore. As usual, Emily had planned everything perfectly. Looking back, I realized that was the first clear sign that someone else was making Emily's decisions. St. Mary's Basilica is a monument to American Catholic ambition, constructed in 1821 when the church was establishing its presence in a predominantly Protestant nation. The building rises from Baltimore's downtown streets like a deliberate challenge to anyone who might question Catholic permanence in the New World. Walking through its massive wooden doors feels like stepping backward through centuries. The interior is designed to inspire awe and humility in equal measure. Soaring stone columns that disappear into shadowed vaulting, stained glass windows that transform sunlight into jeweled prayers, marble floors worn smooth by 200 years of faithful feet seeking grace or forgiveness, or simply a moment of peace in lives that rarely offered any. The air carries layers of scent that tell the building's history. Incense burned during the thousands of masses, candle wax melted in prayer for the living and the dead, the faint metallic smell of old stone that has absorbed centuries of whispered confessions and desperate pleas for divine intervention. Emily moved through this sacred space like someone coming home after a long journey. She touched the carved woodwork with familiar affection, genuflected before the tabernacle with practiced grace, and chose her position before the baptismal font as if she'd stood there many times before. The font itself was a masterpiece of 19th century craftsmanship, a massive basin carved from single piece of Carrara marble, decorated with reliefs depicting scenes from Christ's own baptism in the Jordan River. Holy water filled the basin to precisely the correct liturgical depth, blessed that morning by Father Vittorio Leone using oils that had been consecrated in Rome and shipped to Baltimore in a wooden case that bore the Vatican's official seal. Father Leone was everything central casting would order for a parish priest. Gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, hands that showed the calluses of someone who'd worked construction before receiving his calling, a voice that carried just enough Italian accent to remind listeners that Catholic authority traced its lineage back to Rome itself. Emily had specifically requested him after meeting him during a youth retreat 6 months earlier. She has remarkable theological sophistication for someone her age, Father Leone had told our parents during their preliminary meeting. Her understanding of Catholic doctrine is more advanced than many priests I know. It's quite extraordinary. October 15th dawned with the kind of crisp autumn beauty that makes believers thank God, and skeptics wonder if they're missing something important. Leaves painted Baltimore in brilliant oranges and reds, and morning sunlight struck St. Mary's twin spires with such perfect timing that it seemed choreographed by divine providence. Inside the basilica, only 8 people had gathered for Emily's ceremony. Our parents sat in the second pew, our Aunt Margaret beside them, 2 of Emily's friends from youth group, myself with my camera and notebook, and Mrs. Chen from our neighbourhood, who'd driven down to Baltimore because she'd been present for Emily's infant baptism 16 years earlier. Emily wore our grandmother's confirmation dress, simple white cotton that had been carefully preserved in tissue paper for 4 decades. Her dark hair was braided with small white flowers that our mother had ordered from the same florist who provided decorations for Emily's first communion. She looked radiant in the way that convinced everyone present that we were witnessing something genuinely sacred. Father Leone began the ceremony with prayers that echoed beautifully in the vaulted space, his voice carrying the rhythmic cadence of liturgy that had been refined over centuries of repetition. Emily's responses rang clear and certain, each word enunciated with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind. Do you reject Satan and all his works and all his empty promises? I do reject him. Do you believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth? I do believe. Do you believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was born of the Virgin Mary, suffered death and was buried, rose again from the dead, and sits at the right hand of the Father? I do believe. Her voice carried a resonance that seemed to fill every corner of the basilica, as if the stone walls themselves were amplifying her words. I remember thinking how perfect she looked standing before that ancient font, how absolutely certain of her spiritual path. Our parents wiped away tears of pride. Even I, cynical journalist that I was, felt moved by the sincerity of her conviction. Father Leone blessed the water with prayers in Latin that had been spoken over baptismal fonts for 1500 years. He dipped his fingers in the consecrated water, made the sign of the cross with the deliberate precision of someone performing a sacred act, and approached Emily with the kind of paternal tenderness that reminded everyone present why people trust priests with their souls. "Emily Catherine Kline," he began, his voice warm with genuine affection, "I baptize you in the name of the Father." The holy water touched Emily's forehead, and reality shattered. Her entire body went rigid with mechanical precision, every muscle locking simultaneously as if someone had thrown an electrical switch. Her spine arched backward at an angle that should have snapped bone, and her jaw unhinged beyond the limits of human anatomy, opening wide enough to accommodate something far larger than any human mouth was designed to hold. From her throat came words in perfect Aramaic, the ancient language of Christ himself, spoken with pronunciation that would have impressed biblical scholars and linguistic experts. I didn't understand what she was saying, but the sound made my blood turn to ice water and my vision blur around the edges. The words carried a weight that seemed to press against my chest, making it difficult to breathe. They echoed off the stone walls with impossible acoustics, as if the basilica itself had become a resonating chamber designed to amplify voices that had no business speaking in sacred spaces. Then St. Mary's bells began to ring. The massive bronze bells in the tower had been silent for 20 years due to structural concerns about the aging bell mechanisms. The ropes had been removed, the access stairs blocked off, the entire system officially decommissioned by the Archdiocese as a safety precaution. Yet they rang with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of Baltimore. The sound was wrong in every way that mattered. Instead of the clear, resonant tones that church bells are supposed to produce, these rang with a metallic screech that suggested metal tearing against metal under enormous stress. The rhythm was chaotic, arrhythmic, like a funeral dirge composed by someone who'd never heard music but understood on an instinctive level how sound could be weaponized against human sanity. Emily's eyes rolled back until only white showed, and she began speaking in multiple voices that layered over each other in impossible harmonies. Ancient languages poured from her mouth in overlapping streams. Latin mixed with Hebrew, Greek tangled with tongues that predated recorded civilization, syllables that seemed to bypass human hearing and speak directly to something deeper and more primitive than conscious thought. Her body began contorting in ways that violated basic anatomy, her arms twisted behind her back, rotating at shoulder joints that shouldn't have been able to accommodate such movement without dislocation. Her neck turned almost completely around, allowing her to maintain eye contact with me, while her torso faced the altar. When our eyes met, I saw something looking back at me that recognized me, on a level that went far deeper than mere visual identification. It knew me in ways that suggested it had been watching me my entire life, cataloguing my thoughts and emotions and weaknesses for some purpose I couldn't begin to understand. Father Leone stumbled backward, his prayer book tumbling from shaking hands to scatter its pages across marble that had suddenly become ice cold, despite the warm October afternoon outside. The holy water in the baptismal font began to bubble and steam, transforming from crystal clear to deep red. Not the bright red of fresh blood, but the dark, thick crimson of something that had been spilling slowly for a very long time. The temperature in the Basilica plummeted so rapidly that our breath became visible in the suddenly arctic air. Frost began forming on the interior surfaces of stained glass windows, creating patterns that looked almost like writing in a script none of us could read. The electric lights flickered and dimmed, leaving us in twilight illuminated only by dozens of votive candles that somehow continued burning despite the supernatural cold. Emily's impossible voice rose to a crescendo that seemed to penetrate bone and resonate in the hollow spaces of our skulls. The layered languages wove together into something that sounded almost like singing, a hymn written in tongues that human mouths were never meant to speak, performed by a choir of entities that had been waiting centuries for the opportunity to make themselves heard. The stone walls began to pulse in rhythm with her voice, as if the Basilica itself had become a living thing, with Emily's possessed vocal cords as its heartbeat. Dust sifted down from the vaulted ceiling as 200-year-old masonry shifted under stresses that had nothing to do with gravity or structural engineering. Then, with the same abruptness that had marked its beginning, the phenomenon ended. Emily collapsed unconscious onto the marble floor, her body folding in on itself like a marionette with severed strings. The bells stopped their impossible ringing so suddenly that the silence seemed to echo. The temperature began its slow return to normal, and the electric lights steadied to their usual brightness. But the holy water in the font remained red. Father Leone knelt beside Emily, checking her pulse with hands that trembled despite his obvious efforts to maintain clerical composure. She was alive but completely unresponsive, her breathing shallow and irregular, her skin cold to the touch despite the Basilica's return to normal temperature. "Should we call an ambulance?" our father asked, his voice tight with the kind of panic that comes from witnessing something that challenges every assumption about the nature of reality. "No hospitals," Father Leone replied, without taking his eyes off Emily's unconscious form. "Not for this. I need to make some calls immediately." He produced a cell phone from beneath his vestments and stepped away from our family, speaking in rapid Italian to someone who apparently answered on the first ring. The conversation was brief, urgent, and conducted in tones too low for us to overhear, but I caught fragments that included words like immediate intervention and Vatican protocols. Within 2 hours, a black sedan with diplomatic plates arrived at St. Mary's Basilica. The men who emerged wore plain black cassocks that identified them as priests while revealing nothing about their specific rank, diocese, or authority within the church hierarchy. They introduced themselves simply as Father Augustine and Father Constantine, offering no surnames or credentials, beyond the obvious fact that they possessed the kind of quiet authority that made questioning them seem both pointless and dangerous. Both spoke English with subtle Italian accents that suggested Vatican origins, and they carried identical briefcases that locked with mechanical precision. Their faces were ageless in the way that could have indicated either exceptional genetics or something more unsettling than good fortune in the genetic lottery. Emily had been moved to a counselling room in the rectory, where she remained unconscious despite medical attention from a doctor who'd arrived with the Vatican representatives. Her vital signs were stable but weak, and her skin had taken on a greyish pallor that suggested something was fundamentally wrong at the cellular level. The Vatican emissaries immediately established control of the situation with the kind of quiet efficiency that spoke of extensive experience managing similar crises. All electronic devices were confiscated and secured in a metal container that one of them produced from his briefcase. No photographs would be permitted under any circumstances. No discussion of the day's events with anyone outside the immediate family under penalty of excommunication and what they termed canonical prosecution, a phrase they delivered in tones that suggested consequences far more severe than simple expulsion from the church. "Your daughter is experiencing what we classify as acute spiritual distress. Father Augustine explained to our parents in heavily accented English that carried undertones of both sympathy and absolute authority. This condition requires specialized medical care that is available only through Vatican facilities specifically designed for such cases. What kind of specialized care? Our mother demanded, her nursing background making her automatically suspicious of vague medical terminology and evasive explanations. The kind that conventional hospitals are not equipped to provide. Father Constantine replied with finality that discouraged further questions. We have protocols for situations like this developed over centuries of experience with similar cases. Our parents had no choice but to agree. The alternative was accepting that their daughter had been genuinely possessed by supernatural forces during a sacred ceremony, and that was a reality too terrifying to acknowledge without professional guidance. Emily was sedated with an injection that Father Constantine produced from his briefcase, a clear liquid in a medical vial that bore Vatican pharmacy markings. Within 30 minutes, a medical transport team arrived to move her to a private jet waiting at Baltimore Washington International Airport. When our parents attempted to accompany Emily, they were politely but firmly informed that Vatican medical facilities maintained strict confidentiality protocols for security reasons. They would receive regular updates on Emily's condition, but visitation would not be permitted until her treatment was complete. I watched from the rectory window as my unconscious sister was loaded into an ambulance that bore no hospital markings, only a small Vatican coat of arms on the driver's door. The vehicle disappeared into Baltimore traffic, taking Emily to a destination none of us were allowed to know. That night, I went home and began the research that would ultimately damn my soul. My apartment felt different after Emily's abduction. Colder, quieter, somehow less substantial than it had been that morning. I sat at my computer and started searching for information about Project Custodia, the phrase I'd overheard during the priest's whispered conversation at St. Mary's. Initial searches returned nothing useful, but I'd expected that. Vatican operations weren't likely to maintain public websites advertising their activities. I shifted to academic databases, theological journals, and historical archives looking for any reference to Catholic procedures for handling supernatural emergencies. Slowly, a disturbing picture began to emerge. I found a 16th century letter from a Vatican official to the Holy Roman Emperor, mentioning protocols for the containment of apostatic influences during the administration of sacred rites. An 18th century document referenced Project Custodia procedures in relation to a series of possession cases that had threatened to undermine Catholic authority in rural Austria. Most illuminating was a doctoral dissertation written by a defrocked priest named Thomas Whitmore, who'd spent 5 years researching what he called Vatican suppression of sacramental anomalies. According to Whitmore's research, the Church had been documenting and concealing cases of supernatural interference during baptisms, confirmations, and ordinations for over 8 centuries. The pattern was always the same: young people experiencing possession during sacred ceremonies, immediate Vatican intervention, transportation to undisclosed facilities for treatment, and eventual return to normal life with no memory of their experiences. But Whitmore had found evidence suggesting that not all subjects returned unchanged. His research included interviews with family members who reported personality changes in relatives who'd undergone Vatican treatment for spiritual emergencies. Subjects who'd been devoutly religious before their experiences often returned with dramatically altered relationships to their faith. Some became atheists overnight, while others developed obsessive behaviors related to church doctrine and history. Most disturbing were reports of enhanced abilities that couldn't be explained through conventional psychology or medicine. Improved pattern recognition, enhanced memory, uncanny ability to read people's emotional states and motivations. Characteristics that made subjects exceptionally effective in careers requiring social manipulation or information analysis. Whitmore's dissertation had been rejected by every Catholic university where he'd submitted it, and he'd eventually been defrocked for spreading harmful speculation about church operations. He died in a car accident 3 months after his dismissal, and copies of his research had been systematically removed from academic libraries. I found a single remaining copy, archived on an obscure server maintained by a conspiracy theory website, posted by someone who'd apparently stolen it from Whitmore's personal files before his death. As I read Whitmore's research, strange things began happening in my apartment. My grandmother's crucifix, a simple stainless steel cross that had hung above my bed for 5 years without incident, developed rust stains that appeared overnight. When I tried to clean them, the rust returned within hours, spreading like an infection across the metal surface until the entire cross was stained the colour of dried blood. My laptop began filling with text I hadn't typed. I'd wake up in the morning to find documents open on my screen, filled with Latin passages I didn't recognise. Some were quotes from the Rituale Romanum, the official Catholic manual for performing exorcisms. Others appeared to be from much older sources, medieval texts about fallen angels, pre-Christian invocations, written in languages that predated recorded history. Most disturbing were the footprints. 4 mornings in a row, I woke to find my bedroom door standing open, and muddy footprints leading from the hallway to Emily's room across the hall. They were small prints, approximately Emily's size, but the mud was unlike anything from our Pennsylvania neighbourhood. It was dark red clay mixed with what looked like ash, and it smelled of sulphur and burning myrrh. Each time, I cleaned the prints with bleach and made sure to lock my bedroom door before sleeping. Each morning, the door was open again, and fresh prints marked the path to Emily's empty room. On the 5th day, my phone rang. "Mr. Kline, this is Dr. Harlan Cross. I believe we need to talk." Dr. Cross was a forensic psychiatrist who'd once consulted for the Archdiocese of Boston on what he carefully termed unusual cases. He'd heard about Emily's incident through informal networks that connected mental health professionals who'd encountered similar situations, and he wanted to meet before I did something that would put both Emily and myself in additional danger. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in Georgetown, far enough from Baltimore to ensure our conversation wouldn't be monitored by anyone with an interest in Emily's case. Dr. Cross was in his 50s, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of exhausted eyes that spoke of professional encounters with things that had fundamentally altered his understanding of reality. He looked like a man who'd spent years staring into an abyss that had been staring back with predatory intelligence. "I heard about your sister through channels I can't identify without compromising other people's safety," he began, stirring his coffee with hands that showed a barely perceptible tremor. "I've consulted on 4 similar cases over the past 15 years. All involved possession during Catholic sacraments. All were handled by Vatican representatives using identical protocols, and none of the subjects were ever the same afterward." He leaned forward, lowering his voice to ensure our conversation remained private despite the coffee shop's crowded atmosphere. "Your sister's symptoms match exactly what I documented in confidential reports that I was ordered to destroy. The Aramaic speaking, the physical contortions, the environmental effects, particularly the bells. There's always something with bells." Dr. Cross explained that he had first encountered these cases during his residency at McLean Hospital in Massachusetts. A 9-year-old boy had been admitted after exhibiting violent behaviour following his first communion ceremony. The child spoke fluent Latin despite having no education in classical languages, and he demonstrated detailed knowledge of Catholic doctrine that would have challenged seminary professors. Vatican representatives arrived within 6 hours of his admission, Dr. Cross continued. "Same pattern you experienced with your sister, minimal identification, immediate assertion of authority, transportation to an undisclosed facility for specialized treatment. He tried to follow up on the boy's case, but all records had been sealed by court order. When he'd attempted to contact the child's family, he'd been informed that they'd relocated and left no forwarding address. The second case involved a 16-year-old girl whose confirmation ceremony in Connecticut had been interrupted by what witnesses described as a localized earthquake that affected only the church building. Security cameras captured footage of the girl levitating 18 inches off the ground while reciting passages from the Book of Enoch in ancient Hebrew. That footage disappeared from the church's security system within hours, Dr. Cross said, his voice carrying the frustration of someone who'd spent years trying to document evidence that powerful people preferred to keep hidden. But I'd seen enough by then to recognize a pattern. He pulled out a worn notebook and showed me pages filled with cramped handwriting, notes about the Book of Enoch, an ancient Hebrew text that described fallen angels who had corrupted humanity before the Great Flood. While not part of official Catholic scripture, the book was studied by Vatican scholars as a historical document that might contain accurate information about supernatural entities. According to church research that I was privileged to access, Dr. Cross explained, fallen angels called apostatic watchers specifically target moments of spiritual transformation, baptisms, confirmations, ordinations, any ceremony where a human soul becomes more closely aligned with divine grace. He described a third case that had brought him to the attention of Vatican officials, a 30-year-old man undergoing adult baptism at a cathedral in Philadelphia. During the ceremony, the man had apparently been possessed by multiple entities simultaneously, speaking in 7 different ancient languages while his body contorted into positions that required broken bones to achieve. The possession lasted 6 hours, Dr. Cross said, his voice heavy with memories he'd clearly rather forget. 7 different entities, each speaking through him in turn. They identified themselves using names from pre-Christian mythology, Mesopotamian demons, Egyptian death gods, beings that predated organized religion by thousands of years. That case had resulted in Dr. Cross being recruited as a Vatican consultant, a position that gave him access to classified church documents about similar incidents. Over 5 years, he'd examined dozens of possession cases, all sharing characteristics that traditional Catholic exorcism couldn't address. The Church's official position is straightforward, he continued. These cases cannot exist because they challenge fundamental Catholic doctrine about the absolute protection God provides during sacred ceremonies. If demons can hijack baptisms and confirmations, what does that say about the efficacy of the sacraments themselves? Dr. Cross then told me something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Your sister has been taken to a facility beneath the Vatican Apostolic Archive in Rome. Project Custodia isn't a treatment program, it's a protocol for transferring supernatural entities from subjects who can't contain them into volunteers who can... He leaned back in his chair, studying my face for signs that I understood the implications of what he was telling me. The Vatican doesn't perform exorcisms on apostatic watcher victims. They perform extractions. They remove the entities from children and adolescents whose developing minds are being damaged by the presence, and they relocate those entities into adult volunteers who are psychologically prepared to serve as permanent hosts. The coffee shop seemed to fade around me as the full horror of Emily's situation became clear. You're saying they're going to put whatever possessed Emily into someone else? Not someone else, Dr. Cross replied quietly. Someone who loves her enough to volunteer for the transfer. Someone who would sacrifice anything to save her, even if it means sacrificing themselves. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card with only a phone number printed on it. If you decide to go to Rome to find your sister, call this number first. There are people who can help you navigate Vatican City without official authorization. But understand, once you enter that facility, you're not walking out unchanged. Dr. Cross stood to leave, but paused at the coffee shop door. "One more thing you should know. The entities that possess people during sacraments aren't random demons looking for convenient hosts. They're specifically targeting individuals who've been prepared for them over years or even decades." He met my eyes with an expression that mixed sympathy with something approaching pity. "Your sister's exceptional faith, her unusual maturity, her perfect behaviour, those weren't natural developments. Emily was groomed for possession from childhood. The entity that took her during the baptism had been influencing her development for years." He walked out into the Georgetown afternoon, leaving me alone with knowledge that fundamentally changed everything I thought I knew about my sister's life. I sat in that coffee shop for 3 hours, drinking cold coffee and trying to process what Dr. Cross had told me. If Emily had been under supernatural influence since childhood, then who was my sister really? Had there ever been a genuine Emily Kline? Or had I spent 16 years loving an imposter created by something that wasn't human? The questions were unbearable, but the answers were worse. That evening, I made a decision that would damn me as surely as if I'd signed a contract with the devil himself. I liquidated my savings account, maxed out every credit card I owned, and booked a flight to Rome. The Vatican Apostolic Archive occupies a complex of buildings adjacent to the Sistine Chapel, connected by underground tunnels that date back to medieval times when paranoid popes needed secure escape routes from their enemies. Most tourists never see these areas, but researchers with proper credentials can access reading rooms where church scholars have worked for centuries to preserve and study documents that span 2,000 years of Christian history. Using my journalism credentials and what remained of my professional reputation, I gained access under the pretext of researching 19th century American Catholic immigration patterns, a topic obscure enough to avoid suspicion while providing legitimate reasons to examine historical church records. My contact was Sister Benedetta Toriani, a Vatican archivist in her 70s who'd spent 5 decades organising and cataloguing the church's most sensitive historical materials. She was a tiny woman with sharp eyes behind thick glasses, and she possessed the kind of institutional knowledge that made her invaluable to researchers seeking specific information from the archive's vast collections. "American Catholic history, yes," she said in heavily accented English when I presented my research credentials. "Very popular topic with scholars these days. Many people interested in immigration patterns, establishment of parishes, relationships between American dioceses and European church authorities." I explained that I was specifically interested in unusual cases from the 19th and early 20th centuries, incident where American parishes had requested Vatican intervention for problems that couldn't be resolved through normal diocesan channels. Sister Benedetta's expression became more guarded. "Unusual problems? You mean administrative disputes, financial irregularities, doctrinal disagreements?" "More like spiritual emergencies," I said carefully. "Cases where American priests encountered situations that exceeded their training or experience to handle." She studied me for a long moment, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that she was evaluating not just my research credentials, but my psychological fitness to handle sensitive information. "There are some documents," she said finally, "but they are restricted access. You would need special authorization from the prefect of the archive, and such authorization can take months or years to obtain." I was prepared for this obstacle. What if I were researching a specific case that involved my own family? Would that qualify for expedited access under compassionate grounds? Sister Benedetta's eyes sharpened with interest. "Your family was involved in a case requiring Vatican intervention." "My sister was involved in an incident 4 weeks ago," I said, deciding that honesty might be more effective than elaborate deception. "She's currently in Vatican custody, and I'm trying to understand what happened to her." The elderly nun was quiet for several minutes, apparently weighing institutional loyalties against human compassion. Finally, she made a decision that probably saved my life. though I didn't realize it at the time. Come with me, she said, rising from her desk, with surprising agility. But understand, what I show you must remain absolutely confidential. There are aspects of church history that were never intended for public knowledge. She led me through a series of corridors and stairwells that descended far beneath the Vatican's public areas. The architecture changed as we went deeper, from Renaissance marble and elaborate frescoes to medieval stone, and finally to chambers that looked more like ancient catacombs than modern administrative buildings. These levels were constructed on the foundations of much older structures, Sister Benedetta explained as we walked through increasingly narrow passages lit by electric bulbs that had been retrofitted into medieval wall sconces. Some sections date back to the original Constantinian Basilica, others to pre-Christian Roman construction. The church has always been careful to preserve its institutional memory, even the memories it would prefer to forget. We arrived at a reading room that looked more like a medieval scriptorium than a modern archive. Heavy wooden tables were illuminated by brass lamps that cast warm pools of light across leather-bound volumes, and manila folders that showed the wear of centuries. The air smelled of old paper, preservative chemicals, and something else, something that reminded me of the metallic taste that had filled my mouth during Emily's possession. Sister Benedetta disappeared into the stacks and returned with a collection of documents that made my hands shake as I opened them. The folder was labelled In Nomine Infantium, in the name of the infants, and it contained case files spanning 800 years of church history. Children and adolescents possessed during baptisms, confirmations, and ordinations, all investigated by Vatican officials, all resolved through protocols that were never officially documented in public church records. The earliest case dated from 1203, involving a 12-year-old boy in Toulouse whose baptism had been interrupted when he began speaking in what local priests identified as the language of demons. The Vatican response team, according to the Latin report, had successfully contained the apostatic influence through transfer protocols blessed by His Holiness, Pope Innocent III. Case after case followed the same pattern over the centuries. Young people possessed during sacred ceremonies, immediate Vatican intervention, transportation to undisclosed facilities for treatment, and eventual resolution through procedures that were described in deliberately vague language. But it was a file from 1893 that made me understand the true horror of what was happening to Emily. The Ferrara case involved 15-year-old Maria Benedetta Rossi, whose confirmation ceremony had been interrupted by what witnesses described as the voice of the abyss speaking through an innocent vessel. The girl had spoken fluent Aramaic, ancient Greek, and what church scholars identified as Enochian, the alleged language of angels described in medieval grimoires. The possession had lasted 9 days, during which multiple Vatican officials had attempted traditional exorcism protocols without success. The entity had demonstrated knowledge of church secrets that were known only to high-ranking Vatican officials, and it had threatened to reveal compromising information about papal finances and political arrangements unless its demands were met. The final resolution, according to the report signed by 3 cardinals, including the future Pope Leo XIII, had been achieved through apostolic transfer procedures in accordance with the Custodia protocols established under the authority of His Holiness Pope Urban IV. The last entry in Maria's file was a single line written in different handwriting. Subject expired during final procedure. Entity successfully contained within designated vessel. Transfer complete. I photographed every page with a camera, concealed in my jacket, my hands trembling, as I documented evidence of a conspiracy that had operated for nearly a millennium. The Vatican hadn't just been covering up possession cases. They'd been systematically transferring supernatural entities from children into adult volunteers treating fallen angels like hazardous waste that required secure containment. As I worked, footsteps echoed in the archive corridor outside the reading room. Sister Benedetta looked up from her own work with an expression of alarm that suggested she recognized those particular footsteps. "Someone is coming," she whispered urgently. "These files must not be seen by unauthorized personnel." She quickly gathered the documents and returned them to their storage location while I pocketed my camera and tried to look like a legitimate researcher studying immigration records. The reading room door opened and Cardinal Severin De Luca entered. He was a tall, severe man in his 60s, wearing crimson robes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His presence filled the medieval chamber with an authority that was both clerical and temporal, and his pale blue eyes swept the room with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to identifying threats and neutralizing them before they could become fun enough problematic. "Sister Benedetta," he said in English that carried only the faintest trace of an Italian accent. "I understand we have a visiting researcher." "Yes, Your Eminence," she replied with the carefully neutral respect of someone who'd learned to be cautious around powerful Vatican officials. "Mr. Kline is studying 19th century American Catholic immigration patterns." Cardinal De Luca's gaze settled on me with uncomfortable intensity. I felt like a laboratory specimen being examined by a scientist who already knew exactly what he was looking at and was simply confirming his hypothesis. "Mr. Daniel Kline from Pennsylvania," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Brother to Miss Emily Kline, who recently experienced spiritual difficulties during her baptism at St. Mary's Basilica in Baltimore." There was no point in pretending surprise at his knowledge. Vatican intelligence networks were apparently as efficient as their reputation suggested, and my arrival in Rome hadn't exactly been covert. "I'm trying to understand what happened to my sister," I said, meeting his gaze despite every instinct telling me to look away. "And what precisely do you hope to accomplish with that understanding?" he asked with a slight smile that carried no warmth whatsoever. "Do you imagine that knowledge will enable you to rescue her from her current situation?" "I want to know if she's safe." Cardinal De Luca was quiet for a moment, studying my face with the attention of a chess master, evaluating his opponent's position several moves before checkmate. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision that had probably been inevitable from the moment I had entered Vatican City. "Mr. Kline, you have traveled a considerable distance and expended substantial resources to reach Rome. Perhaps it would be educational for you to see precisely what we are dealing with regarding your sister's case. Knowledge, after all, is preferable to dangerous speculation." He gestured towards the reading room door with the kind of casual authority that made refusal seem both impossible and pointless. "Would you care to accompany me on a brief tour of our specialized facilities?" Sister Benedetta shot me a warning look that I chose to ignore. I'd come to Rome to find Emily, and Cardinal De Luca was offering to take me directly to her. The fact that this was obviously a trap didn't change the reality that it might be my only chance to see my sister alive. "I'd be honored, Your Eminence." Cardinal De Luca led me through a maze of corridors and stairwells that descended far beneath the Vatican's tourist areas. We passed through multiple security checkpoints staffed by Swiss guards in civilian clothes, each carrying communications equipment and sidearms that looked distinctly military in nature. Project Custodia, De Luca explained as we walked through increasingly ancient architecture, was established in 1263 by Pope Urban IV, following a series of possessions that threatened to undermine public faith in the Church's spiritual authority. When supernatural entities can corrupt sacred ceremonies, the very foundation of Catholic doctrine is called into question. We descended through layers of history, made visible in stone and mortar. Renaissance marble gave way to medieval masonry, which eventually yielded to chambers that predated Christianity in Rome. The walls were carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them, and the air carried a metallic taste that made my tongue feel numb. "The entities that possessed your sister are not common demons, DeLuca continued, his voice echoing off stone walls that had been absorbing secrets for over 1,000 years. Apostatic watchers are fallen angels of considerable power and intelligence. They specifically target moments of spiritual transformation because such moments represent humanity's attempt to move closer to divine grace. We passed through chambers filled with artifacts that looked like they belonged in a museum of medieval torture devices rather than a religious institution. Iron restraints designed to hold struggling humans, surgical instruments that seemed too advanced for their apparent age, monitoring equipment that combined modern electronics with brass fittings that suggested centuries of continuous use and refinement. These entities find human spiritual development offensive, DeLuca explained, noting my attention to the restraint devices. They view our attempts to achieve salvation as a form of rebellion against the natural order they helped establish before their own fall from grace. We arrived at a massive steel door that looked more like a bank vault than anything belonging in a religious institution. Cardinal DeLuca placed his palm on a biometric scanner, and the door opened with a hiss of escaping air that suggested the chamber beyond was maintained under specific atmospheric conditions. The underground cathedral that lay beyond the steel door was perhaps the most beautiful and terrifying space I'd ever seen. Carved from living rock, the chamber stretched upward into darkness that powerful floodlights couldn't fully penetrate. The walls were covered with frescoes that seemed to move in my peripheral vision, depicting scenes from Christian history mixed with older imagery that predated the church by millennia. Angels and demons battled across vast murals, their faces bearing expressions of agony and ecstasy that seemed to change depending on the viewing angle. At the center of the space stood an altar that appeared to have been carved from a single block of black marble, its surface inlaid with silver symbols that hurt to look at directly. Surrounding the altar was restraining apparatus that combined medieval craftsmanship with modern medical precision, leather straps reinforced with steel cables, monitoring equipment that tracked both physical and spiritual vital signs, IV stands that held bags of fluid I couldn't identify. Emily lay unconscious on the altar. My sister's appearance, it changed so dramatically that I almost didn't recognize her. She'd lost at least 20 pounds, her hair had gone completely white, and her skin had taken on a translucent quality that showed the network of veins beneath, like a road map of her circulation. She looked fragile in a way that suggested her body was consuming itself from within. The entity inside your sister is not merely possessing her, Cardinal DeLuca explained as we approached the altar. Apostatic watchers don't simply inhabit human hosts. They remake them from the cellular level upward, transforming human biology to better accommodate their supernatural presence. Father Leone stood nearby, but he was no longer the gentle priest I remembered from Baltimore. His eyes were hollow with exhaustion, his hands shaking as he held an ancient leather-bound book that looked like it had been rebound many times over the centuries. He looked like a man who'd spent weeks staring into something that had fundamentally altered his understanding of reality. We have attempted conventional exorcism protocols for 4 weeks, DeLuca continued. The Rituale Romanum, the prayers of Leo XIII, even experimental procedures developed by Vatican scholars over the past century. The entity only grows stronger with each attempt, feeding on our efforts to cast it out. As if responding to his words, Emily's eyes opened. Not the white orbs of possession I'd witnessed during the baptism, but her natural brown eyes filled with an intelligence that was both familiar and utterly alien. "Hello, Daniel," she said in a voice that was recognizably Emily's, but carried harmonics that no human throat should have been able to produce. The sound seemed to resonate in my bones rather than my ears, creating vibrations that I felt in my chest cavity and the hollow spaces of my skull. "I was wondering when you'd finally come to visit," she continued, and when she smiled, it was Emily's smile, combined with something predatory, that made my skin crawl with recognition I couldn't quite place. "We've been having the most fascinating conversations with your Vatican friends," Emily said, her eyes never leaving mine. "Did you know that Cardinal De Luca has personally overseen 63 entity transfers over the past 30 years? He's become quite skilled at the procedure." Cardinal De Luca's expression remained carefully neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested Emily had revealed information he'd preferred to keep private. "The entity is attempting to manipulate your emotional response," he said calmly. "It will use your sister's appearance and mannerisms to lower your psychological defenses. This is a standard tactic among apostatic watchers." Emily laughed, and the sound echoed off the stone walls with impossible acoustics that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. The laughter layered over itself, creating harmonies that suggested dozens of voices sharing the same joke. "Manipulation," she said with genuine amusement. "Oh, Cardinal, you give us far too little credit. We're not manipulating anything. We're simply telling truths that you've spent centuries trying to hide." She turned her attention back to me, and despite every rational thought in my head, I found myself stepping closer to the altar. This was my sister, regardless of what might be sharing space in her mind. And she looked so fragile strapped to that medieval contraption. "Do you want to know the real truth about what happened during the baptism, Daniel?" Emily asked, her voice soft with the same affection she'd shown me throughout our entire lives. "It wasn't a possession at all. We didn't invade Emily's body during the ceremony." She paused, studying my face with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world to deliver devastating revelations. "We've been with Emily since she drew her first breath. The baptism didn't invite us in. It tried to cast us out, and we simply couldn't allow that to happen." The words hit me like a physical blow, confirming Dr. Cross's worst implications. If the entity had been with Emily since birth, then everything I thought I knew about my sister was built on a foundation of lies. Every conversation, every shared memory, every moment of sibling affection, all of it had been contaminated by the presence of something that wasn't human. "That's impossible," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were false. Emily's unusual maturity, her perfect behavior, her inexplicable wisdom about subjects she'd never formally studied. It all made terrible sense if she'd been guided by an intelligence far older and more sophisticated than any human child. "Is it really so impossible?" Emily asked with the patient tone of a teacher explaining a difficult concept to a struggling student. "Think about it carefully, Daniel. When did Emily first start showing signs of exceptional intelligence? When did she begin demonstrating knowledge that seemed beyond her chronological age? When did she develop that perfect, unshakable faith that made your parents so proud?" The memories came flooding back with sickening clarity, recontextualized by this new information in ways that made me nauseous. Emily at age 4, comforting our dying grandmother with wisdom that seemed to come from decades of experience with death and grief. Emily at 7, explaining complex theological concepts to our Sunday school teacher with understanding that impressed parish priests. Emily at 10, mediating arguments between our parents with diplomatic skills that would have been impressive in an experienced marriage counsellor. I'd always attributed these qualities to Emily being exceptionally gifted, an old soul who'd simply been born wise beyond her years. The possibility that her wisdom came from something ancient and inhuman wearing her face had never occurred to me. "The baptism wasn't meant to invite us in," Emily continued, her voice taking on undertones that seemed to bypass my conscious hearing and speak directly to something deeper in my brain. "It was meant to cast us out. Your sister, in her genuine faith, truly believed that formal baptism would purify her soul and bring her into perfect alignment with divine grace. She didn't realize that achieving such purity would be completely incompatible with our continued presence." Cardinal De Luca stepped forward, his face grim with understanding. "The entity is telling the truth about the baptism's purpose. We've suspected for some time that certain possession cases involved entities that had been present since infancy, rather than acquired through supernatural attack. But how is that possible? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. Apostatic watchers are creatures of immense patience, DeLuca explained, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd spent decades studying things that challenged his faith rather than strengthening it. They think in terms of centuries rather than years. Some infiltrate developing human consciousness during pregnancy, others attach themselves to newborn infants before the soul becomes fully integrated with the physical body. Emily nodded approvingly, as if DeLuca were a student who'd finally grasped a particularly challenging lesson. Very good, Cardinal. We do indeed prefer what you might call the long game. Emily's exceptional faith wasn't the result of divine blessing. It was the result of 16 years of careful cultivation by an intelligence that understood exactly how to nurture spiritual development. She looked at me with an expression that mixed affection with something approaching pity. We guided her religious education, encouraged her theological studies, and nurtured her desire for baptism. Every prayer she said, every act of charity she performed, every moment of spiritual growth, we were there shaping her development into exactly what we needed her to become. But why? I asked, the question barely a whisper. If you were already in complete control, why risk exposing yourself during the ceremony? Emily's expression grew sad, and for a moment I saw a flash of something that might have been genuine human emotion beneath the ancient intelligence. Because we made a fundamental miscalculation, she said quietly. We underestimated the strength of Emily's genuine faith. She truly believed that baptism would bring her soul into perfect alignment with divine grace, and her belief was so powerful that it began to purify her spiritual essence in ways we hadn't anticipated. The implications were staggering. If Emily's faith had been strong enough to begin exorcising the entity through sheer spiritual force, then, somewhere beneath the alien intelligence, my real sister still existed and was fighting for control. She's still in there, I said, and it wasn't a question. Oh yes, Emily replied with a smile that was equal parts affectionate and predatory. Emily is very much present. She's been fighting us for 4 weeks now, trying to reclaim control of her own mind and body. It's quite admirable, really. Most humans surrender within hours of becoming consciously aware of our presence. Cardinal DeLuca moved to the head of the altar, his hands resting on an ornate brass mechanism that appeared to control the restraint system. This is precisely why conventional exorcism has proven ineffective. We're not dealing with a simple case of demonic possession. We're dealing with a war between two separate consciousness, fighting for control of the same physical body. Which brings us to tonight's procedure, Emily said, her voice taking on a note of anticipation that made my blood run cold. The Vatican has developed a specialized protocol for cases like ours. Since they cannot remove us from Emily without destroying her in the process, they've decided to relocate us to a more suitable host. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. My journey to Rome, Cardinal DeLuca's willingness to bring me to this hidden facility, the convenient timing of Emily's revelation about the entity's true nature. It had all been orchestrated to bring me here for this specific moment. You want to transfer the entity into me, I said, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded. Want is perhaps too strong a word, Cardinal DeLuca replied, but Emily's physical condition is deteriorating rapidly. The spiritual conflict between her consciousness and the entity is consuming her body from within. She has perhaps 24 hours before the stress kills her. I looked at my sister strapped to the medieval altar, noting details I'd missed in my initial shock at seeing her. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, her pulse visible, as her throat was rapid and weak, and her skin had the greyish pallor of someone whose body was failing at the cellular level. The transfer procedure has a 97% success rate, DeLuca continued with the clinical detachment of someone who performed this operation dozens of times. Emily would be freed from the entity's influence and could return to a completely normal life. The entity would be safely contained within an adult host who's psychologically prepared for the experience. "And what happens to me?" Emily answered before the Cardinal could speak. "You become our new home, Daniel. We would share your mind the same way we've shared Emily's for 16 years. The difference is that you're an adult with a fully developed personality and stronger psychological defenses. You could maintain conscious control of your actions while we operated in the background of your thoughts. Like having a permanent roommate in my head." "Something very much like that," Emily said with laughter that sounded genuinely amused. "We're quite skilled at cohabitation when our host is cooperative. Emily's resistance has made our relationship far more adversarial than we typically prefer." Cardinal DeLuca gestured to Father Leone, who began preparing what looked like surgical instruments on a steel table beside the altar. The procedure itself is relatively straightforward. Both participants are sedated and connected to monitoring equipment that tracks spiritual as well as physical, vital signs. The entity is then guided from the original host to the new one through a series of prayers and incantations derived from medieval grimoires. "How long does it take?" "Approximately 8 hours, DeLuca replied. "The entity must be gradually coaxed from one consciousness to another to avoid traumatizing either host. Rushed transfers have resulted in complete psychological collapse for both participants." I studied Emily's face, looking for any sign of my real sister beneath the ancient intelligence that had been controlling her for 16 years. For just a moment, her expression shifted, and I saw something that looked like desperate hope flash in her eyes. "Emily," I said quietly, "are you hearing this?" Her voice, when she responded, was different, weaker, more familiar, recognizably the sister I'd grown up with, rather than the entity that had been speaking through her. "Daniel, please," she whispered, and I could hear genuine terror beneath the words. "I'm so tired of fighting. It's been using my body like a puppet for weeks, and I can feel myself getting weaker every day. I don't know how much longer I can hold on." The entity reasserted control almost immediately, but not before I heard the exhaustion and desperation in Emily's real voice. Whatever had been sharing her mind for 16 years, the past 4 weeks had been a nightmare of conscious imprisonment while something else controlled her every action. "She's suffering," I said to Cardinal DeLuca. "How long can she survive this kind of stress?" "Our medical staff estimates 18 to 24 hours before her body begins shutting down," he replied with the same clinical detachment he'd shown throughout our conversation. "After that point, even a successful transfer might not save her life." The choice, such as it was, had been made before I'd ever set foot in Rome. Emily was dying, and I was the only person who could save her. The fact that saving her would cost me my mental freedom was irrelevant. She was my sister, and I'd been protecting her my entire life. "What do I need to do?" Cardinal DeLuca nodded, as if he'd expected no other answer. "Father Leone will prepare you for the procedure. It begins at midnight and must be completed before dawn. The transition between night and day represents a moment of spiritual vulnerability that makes entity transfer more effective." As Father Leone approached with what looked like surgical scrubs, Emily's voice stopped me. "Daniel, wait. There's something else you need to understand before you agree to this." The tone was different again, not the patient teaching voice of the entity or the desperate plea of my sister, but something that seemed to be both of them speaking in uncomfortable unison. "The transfer procedure isn't reversible," she said, and I could hear both Emily and the entity in every carefully chosen word. "Once we're established in your mind, we'll be there permanently. The Vatican doesn't have protocols for removing apostatic watchers from willing hosts because willing hosts never want to be separated from us." "What do you mean?" Emily's smile was sad and knowing and utterly terrifying. We don't just share mental space, Daniel. We share thoughts, memories, emotions, experiences. After a few months, you won't be able to tell where your consciousness ends and ours begins. You'll think our thoughts as if they were your own. You'll want what we want. You'll become us, willingly and completely. The implication was clear. The Daniel Kline who walked into this underground cathedral would not be the same person who walked out. The entity would gradually subsume my personality over a period of months, and I'd be grateful for the experience. But Emily will be free. Emily will be completely free, both voices confirmed, in perfect unison. I looked around the underground cathedral one last time, noting the medieval restraints, the ancient symbols carved into stone walls that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, the Swiss guards stationed at discrete intervals around the chamber. This was the culmination of 800 years of Vatican research into spiritual warfare, and I was about to become their latest test subject. "I'm ready," I said. The next 8 hours passed like a fever dream painted in shades of pain and impossible beauty. Father Leone administered a sedative that left me conscious but deeply relaxed, strapped to a second altar that had been wheeled into position beside Emily's. Electrodes monitored my heart rate, blood pressure, and brain activity, while additional sensors measured what Cardinal De Luca called spiritual resonance patterns, fluctuations in some form of energy that conventional science didn't recognize, but Vatican researchers had been studying for centuries. The transfer began with prayers in Latin that seemed to make the air itself vibrate with barely contained power. Father Leone read from his ancient grimoire, while De Luca added his voice in harmonies that suggested years of practice with this specific ritual. The smell of burning myrrh filled the underground chamber, mixed with other incenses I couldn't identify, and something else, something that smelled like ozone and copper pennies, and the moment before, lightning strikes. Emily's body began convulsing as the entity fought against being relocated, her supernatural strength testing the limits of restraints that had been designed to hold struggling humans, enhanced by demonic power. Her voice rose in languages that predated recorded history, screaming protests in tongues that made my ears ache and my vision blur around the edges. Then I felt it beginning. The presence in my mind started as barely more than a whisper, a voice so quiet I thought it might be my imagination. It spoke in Emily's voice, offering comfort and reassurance as it began exploring the landscape of my thoughts like a curious child discovering a new playground. The invasion was gentle, almost loving, like being embraced by someone who understood me more completely than I understood myself. There was no violence, no forced entry, just a gradual presence that seemed to belong in my head as naturally as my own thoughts. "Don't fight us, Daniel," the voice said inside my skull. "We're not here to hurt you. We just need a place to rest, a home where we can finally stop running." I felt the entity examining my memories, sorting through decades of experiences like someone browsing through a familiar library. It paused at particularly strong emotional moments. My first day of college, our grandmother's funeral, the pride I'd felt when Emily made honor roll, the terror I'd experienced during her possession, and I could sense its approval of what it found. "You love your sister very much," it observed, with something approaching tenderness. "That love will make our relationship so much easier than it was with Emily. She fought us because she didn't understand what we were offering. You're choosing this willingly." As the hours passed, I began to understand what Emily had experienced for 16 years, and why she'd seemed so much wiser than any normal child. The entity didn't control my thoughts so much as guide them, offering suggestions that felt like my own ideas while providing access to knowledge and understanding that no human could possess. It encouraged certain memories while letting others fade, gradually reshaping my understanding of past events to align with its preferred narrative. Most disturbing was how natural it felt. The presence in my mind didn't seem foreign or invasive. It felt like a part of myself that had always been there, finally given voice. When it suggested that I'd always known Emily was special in ways that couldn't be explained naturally, the idea seemed obvious, rather than revelatory. When it reminded me of moments when I'd suspected she was more than human, those suspicions felt like forgotten wisdom rather than paranoid speculation. By the 4th hour, I was having difficulty remembering why I'd ever thought the entity was something to be feared. The transfer completed just as Cardinal De Luca had predicted. As dawn approached, the presence in Emily's mind withdrew completely, leaving her unconscious but breathing normally for the first time in weeks. The entity settled into my consciousness like water finding its level, and I felt a sense of completion that was both terrifying and deeply satisfying. "How do you feel?" Cardinal De Luca asked, as the medical equipment was disconnected from both altars. "Different," I replied, and was surprised to hear harmonics in my own voice that suggested multiple vocal cords operating in impossible synchronization. "But good. Complete, for the first time in my life." Emily stirred on her altar, her eyes opening to reveal brown irises that looked genuinely human for the first time since her baptism. When she looked at me, there was no ancient intelligence behind her gaze, just my 16-year-old sister, exhausted but recognizably herself. "Daniel," she said weakly, her voice carrying only normal human harmonics. "Is it over? Am I free?" "It's over," I confirmed, though as I spoke I could feel the entity adding layers of meaning to my words that Emily couldn't detect. "You're completely free." Emily smiled, and for the first time since her baptism, it was entirely her own expression. She fell asleep moments later, her breathing deep and regular as her body began the process of recovering from weeks of spiritual warfare. Cardinal De Luca approached my altar with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with something that might have been sympathy. "The transfer was completely successful. Emily will make a full recovery, and the entity is now safely contained within a willing host." "What happens now?" I asked, though I was surprised to realize I already knew the answer. The entity was sharing its knowledge of Vatican protocols, filling in details that Cardinal De Luca hadn't bothered to explain. "Now you return to your normal life," he said. "You'll find that your new mental companion provides significant advantages in many areas. Enhanced pattern recognition, improved memory, better understanding of human psychology, and motivation. Many hosts report substantial improvement in their professional and personal lives." I nodded, understanding that this was how the Vatican maintained the cooperation of transfer subjects. The entities provided their hosts with genuine benefits that made the loss of mental privacy seem like a reasonable trade. "Emily will be flown back to Baltimore tomorrow," De Luca continued. "Her family will be told that she made a complete recovery from her spiritual episode. She'll have no memory of the entity's presence or the events of the past 4 weeks. And me? You're free to leave whenever you feel ready to travel. I suspect you'll find that your perspective on many things has evolved during your time here." He was absolutely right. As I sat up on the medieval altar, I could feel the entity's influence reshaping my understanding of recent events in real time. The Vatican wasn't a sinister conspiracy covering up demonic possession. They were protectors of humanity, brave souls willing to contain ancient evils that threatened innocent people. Cardinal De Luca wasn't a manipulative villain. He was a hero who dedicated his life to saving people like Emily from fates worse than death. Most importantly, I wasn't a victim of supernatural manipulation. I was a volunteer who'd made a conscious choice to save his sister, and I'd been rewarded with mental abilities that most humans could never imagine. The entity was extraordinarily skilled at rewriting personal narratives. I returned to Baltimore 5 days later, and Emily came home the following week, exactly as Cardinal De Luca had promised. To our parents, she appeared to have made a complete recovery, from what Vatican doctors described as a severe psychological episode brought on by religious stress and adolescent hormonal fluctuations. She had no memory of being possessed, no recollection of the entity's presence, and no awareness that anything supernatural had occurred during her baptism. The ceremony had simply been too emotionally overwhelming for her developing mind to process, resulting in a dissociative episode that required specialized psychiatric treatment. She was, for the first time in her life, completely and authentically human. The change in Emily's personality was subtle but noticeable to anyone who'd known her well. Her exceptional wisdom was gone, replaced by the normal intelligence of a bright teenager struggling with typical adolescent concerns. Her perfect faith became the questioning, evolving spirituality of someone genuinely exploring religious belief, rather than channeling ancient knowledge. Her unusual maturity transformed into age-appropriate behavior that sometimes seemed almost childish compared to her previous demeanor. Our parents attributed these changes to trauma recovery, relieved that their daughter was finally acting like a normal 16-year-old. They enrolled her in therapy to help process her episode, and within months, Emily seemed like any other high school student worried about grades and social relationships rather than theological mysteries. I found myself missing the old Emily, though I understood that the person I mourned had never really existed. The entity in my mind helped me adjust to this reality, explaining that humans who'd been guided by apostatic watchers from childhood often seemed diminished when freed from that influence. "She'll be happier this way," my mental companion assured me during quiet moments when we could communicate without external interference. Genuine human experience, even if it's less intellectually sophisticated, provides a kind of fulfillment that borrowed wisdom cannot match. I returned to work as an investigative journalist and almost immediately noticed the benefits Cardinal De Luca had promised. My ability to recognize patterns in complex information had improved dramatically. I could read people's emotional states and motivations with uncanny accuracy, and my memory for details had become practically photographic. Within months, I was breaking stories that had eluded me for years, earning recognition from editors and colleagues who praised my suddenly enhanced investigative instincts. I solved a municipal corruption case that had stymied other reporters for months, uncovered a pharmaceutical fraud scheme that had escaped detection by federal regulators, and exposed a human trafficking network that law enforcement hadn't even suspected existed. The entity explained that these improvements came from sharing mental space with a consciousness that had observed human behavior for millennia. It understood psychology, sociology, and anthropology in ways that no human scholar could match, and it was generous in sharing that knowledge with me. Our relationship was exactly as it had promised, a comfortable cohabitation that benefited both parties. I provided it with a physical form and contemporary human experience, while it offered me intellectual capabilities that felt like superpowers. After 6 months, I could barely remember what it had been like to think without its constant presence, which is why what happened 9 months later was so devastating. I was researching a story about financial irregularities in a Catholic charity when I stumbled across a leaked Vatican document posted on an obscure forum by someone calling themselves Dr. Cross. The document contained information that fundamentally changed my understanding of what had happened to Emily and me. According to the leaked material, Vatican transfer protocols weren't designed to save possession victims. They were designed to create willing hosts for entities that the Church couldn't otherwise contain or control. Apostatic watchers were too powerful to be destroyed through conventional exorcism, so the Vatican had developed a system for relocating them into volunteers who could be monitored and managed indefinitely. Every transfer subject was eventually recruited as a Vatican asset, using their enhanced abilities to serve church interests around the world. The entities were essentially supernatural, intelligence agents and their human hosts were unwitting operatives in a global network that had existed for centuries. The most horrifying revelation was that the entities gradually consumed their hosts' original personalities, not through malicious intent, but as a natural consequence of long-term mental cohabitation. Within 5 to 7 years, transfer subjects ceased to be recognizably human, becoming instead sophisticated puppets, animated by ancient consciousness that merely retained memories of being human. As I read Dr. Cross's leaked document, I felt the entity in my mind attempting to suppress my emotional response to this information. It flooded my thoughts with rationalizations and alternative interpretations, trying to convince me that the document was disinformation spread by enemies of the Church who wanted to undermine Vatican operations. But for the first time since the transfer, I fought back against its influence. The battle for control of my own mind lasted 4 days and nearly killed me. The entity had been patient and subtle in its gradual takeover of my personality, but when directly challenged, it revealed the true extent of its power. It could control my motor functions, suppress my memories, and even alter my perception of reality in real time. I won the battle only because Emily helped me. My sister had been experiencing dreams since returning from Rome, dreams where an ancient voice offered her knowledge and power in exchange for allowing it to return to her mind. She'd initially dismissed these as trauma-related nightmares, but when she noticed my strange behavior during my fight with the entity, she understood what was really happening. Emily arrived at my apartment during the worst of the mental struggle, finding me convulsing on my living room floor while my mind waged war against itself. She held my hand and spoke to me in the gentle voice I remembered from childhood, reminding me of who I'd been before the entity came to live in my thoughts. "You're my big brother Daniel," she said, her voice cutting through the supernatural static in my head. "You taught me to ride a bike when I was 6. You stayed up all night with me when I had pneumonia in 3rd grade. You drove me to ballet recitals even though you hated classical music. You sacrificed yourself to save me, and I'm not going to let that sacrifice be meaningless." Each memory she invoked helped me reclaim a piece of my original personality from the entity's influence. I began to remember what my own thoughts felt like, separate from the ancient consciousness that had been gradually replacing them. The entity, realizing it was losing control, made a final desperate attempt to maintain its hold over my mind. It threatened to kill both Emily and me, rather than allow itself to be contained or expelled. But in making that threat, it revealed something crucial about its nature. Apostatic watchers, despite their power and intelligence, were fundamentally parasitic. They couldn't exist independently in the physical world. They required human hosts to anchor them to material reality. If I died while it was bonded to my consciousness, it would be trapped in a dying brain until my body's electrical activity ceased completely. That knowledge gave me the leverage I needed to negotiate. I couldn't expel the entity entirely. It had integrated too deeply into my neural pathways for complete removal without brain damage. But I could establish boundaries, creating mental spaces where my original personality remained dominant. The entity would continue to share my mind, but as a prisoner rather than a controller. The compromise we reached was uncomfortable but functional. The entity retained access to my sensory input and memory storage, but I regained control over my conscious thoughts and voluntary actions. It could offer suggestions and share knowledge, but it couldn't override my decisions or alter my perceptions without my explicit consent. In exchange, I agreed not to attempt further expulsion procedures that might damage both of us. It's been 3 months since I reclaimed partial control of my own mind, and I'm using this time to document everything before the entity finds a way to reassert its dominance, because I have no illusions about the long-term sustainability of our current arrangement. The entity is patient in ways that humans simply cannot comprehend. It thinks in terms of decades and centuries, and it knows that my resistance will eventually weaken. Every day, it offers me small conveniences and minor enhancements that would be so much easier to accept than to refuse. Every night, it whispers suggestions that would solve my problems if I just allowed it a little more influence over my decisions. It's not malevolent in any human sense. It genuinely believes that merging our consciousness completely would benefit both of us. From its perspective, human individuality is a form of spiritual poverty that it's offering to cure. It can't understand why I cling to the limitations of singular perspective when I could share in the accumulated wisdom of an immortal being. But I've researched the Vatican's historical files and found case studies spanning centuries. Without exception, willing hosts eventually cease to be recognizably human, becoming instead sophisticated automata that serve the Church's interests with supernatural efficiency. Emily visits me regularly, and I can see the concern in her eyes when she notices my ongoing struggle. She's offered to help me find someone who might be able to complete the exorcism I started, but we both know that such an attempt would likely kill me. The entity has had too long to integrate itself into my neural pathways. Instead, I'm documenting this account as a warning to anyone who might encounter similar situations. The Vatican's Project Custodia is real, and it's still active. Cardinal De Luca and his colleagues continue to recruit transfer subjects under the guise of saving possession victims, building a network of enhanced humans who serve as hosts for ancient entities. If you or someone you love experiences supernatural phenomena during a religious ceremony, don't trust the Church's assurances that they can help. Their help comes with a price that's never fully explained until it's too late to refuse payment. Emily has returned to completely normal teenage life. She's dating a boy from her chemistry class, worrying about SAT scores and college applications instead of ancient theological mysteries. She laughs at her boyfriend's jokes, argues with our parents about curfew, and complains about homework like any normal 17-year-old should. Watching her live an authentic human life is both heartbreaking and beautiful. This is who Emily was always meant to be. Not the vessel for an ancient intelligence, but simply herself. Sometimes I catch her humming pop songs while she does dishes, or see her texting friends about weekend plans, and I feel a profound gratitude that makes the entity in my head recoil with something approaching disgust. "You're wasting time on sentiment," it whispers during these moments. "She doesn't remember what she lost. Why mourn something that never truly existed?" But that's where the entity is wrong. Emily's genuine love, her real kindness, her actual faith, those weren't artificial constructs. They were the parts of her that remained human, despite 16 years of supernatural influence. The entity may have guided her development, but it couldn't manufacture the core of who she was. That was always Emily. Tonight, as I finish writing this account, I can feel my grip on my own thoughts weakening. The entity is patient, but it's also persistent. It offers me knowledge about tomorrow's news, insight into my editor's thoughts, solutions to problems I haven't even encountered yet. Each offer is a small surrender, a tiny erosion of the boundary between us. I've hidden copies of this document in locations the entity doesn't know about: safety deposit boxes registered under false names, encrypted files uploaded to servers in countries that don't cooperate with Vatican intelligence networks. If you're reading this, it means either I succeeded in maintaining enough autonomy to release it myself, or someone else found it after I lost the ability to resist the entity's complete integration. Either way, remember this: the Vatican's Project Custodia is real. They're still operating, still transferring entities into willing volunteers, still building their network of enhanced humans serving ancient intelligences. They present themselves as saviors, but they're creating something that humanity was never meant to become. Trust your instincts. If something supernatural happens during a religious ceremony, don't let the church handle it quietly. Make noise, demand transparency, refuse their specialized treatment. The price of their help is always higher than they admit, and it's paid not just by the victims, but by everyone who loves them enough to sacrifice themselves for a cure. Emily is safe now, and that has to be enough, even if the cost was everything I used to be. The entity is stirring in my mind as I type these final words, offering to help me write a better conclusion, one that doesn't paint the Vatican in such an unflattering light. It promises to make this account more persuasive, more literary, more likely to be believed. I'm declining its offer. Some truths are too important to be enhanced by ancient wisdom. Some warnings need to come from purely human voices, flawed and limited as they may be. This is mine. This is the last purely human thought Daniel Kline will ever have.